The dogs and the cats and the monkeys are a lot like you. The chickens and the cows and the geese, they're a lot like me. We all just want to be. We all just want to be. We all just want to live happy and free. Hi. So here we are, another episode of Animals Have Rights. Let me see. Today, right now, driving in, it's spring outside here in Madison, Wisconsin. The flowers all of the trees are in bloom. Some of them actually are just finishing. The tulips are just waning. Daffodils are blooming. And probably about close to 10,000 monkeys and a couple 100,000 other animals have no idea this is going on. They're right now living in concrete or stainless steel cages. They never see the light of day. So keep that in mind as you step outside and look at how beautiful the day is. Know that they're not allowed to know what sort of day it is whatsoever. So let me see. Some quick news items here. Let's see. Do you remember this past winter when the two brothers and one of the brothers' girlfriends and another friend ran down some deer in their snowmobiles? I think they ended up killing maybe 6 deer or something like that. It was apparently quite heinous. Anyway, the attorneys for the 3 men that were involved, the woman she's not being prosecuted. She apparently told everything. She cooperated with the authorities. But the 3 men that were driving the snowmobiles, they've made a motion that said that animal cruelty charges aren't appropriate because wild animals can't be treated cruelly. It's impossible to be cruel to a wild animal since no one knows them, apparently, or no one owns them. And the judge just threw out that motion and said that the case would go forward, that in fact even wild animals could be cruelly treated. So that's good news. A speck of good news there. Let's see. Another news item here. This just in. This is from the Chicago. Actually, it's from the Associated Press. Madison, Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin-Madison has suspended a research employee who has been charged with the possession of child pornography. UW-Madison spokeswoman Amy Toberin said Wednesday that Sydney Gullins has been placed on paid leave while the university investigates inappropriate behavior on the job. Gullins has worked as an animal research technician in the university's medical school since 2004. He makes about $30,000 a year in his job caring for animals used in research projects. The 40-year-old was charged last week with 2 counts of possession of child pornography after the state agents found inappropriate material on a laptop computer during a search of his Madison apartment. It doesn't explain why they were searching his apartment, and it's pretty interesting that it was inappropriate behavior on the job. So who knows what that's all about. Just a little reminder that there's talk right now. The university wants to expand the Primate Center and wants to spend a couple $1 million to put in an infectious disease center in the Primate Center. And if I were living in the Vilas neighborhood or in the area around the Primate Center, I'd be a little alarmed by the idea that they're going to be studying infectious diseases there. We know that the history of Wisconsin and the study of infectious diseases is a little iffy. They've quit making their isolation hoods called the Madison cabinets. They quit selling them. They decided that they were so prone to leaking and accidental exposures to researchers working on infectious diseases that they've stopped selling those around the country. We know that Yoshihiro Kawaoka was studying the 1918 Spanish flu and was cited by the CDC for using unsafe methods, putting potentially the entire community, perhaps the whole world, since it was a worldwide epidemic at one time, at risk. So if you're living near that area, you might want to think about contacting your elder and talking to them about that. Let me see. Thanks for all your calls going into Whole Foods. They've changed their story a couple times about why they're not going to have the Bratfest there. They've said, well, we've just changed our mind, or they've said that the Alliance for Animals is just committing too many criminal acts. They're just one thing after another. What it boils down to is that the researchers at the university, the animal researchers, basically they disparaged the Alliance, and the Whole Foods manager believed them. That's too bad. And just real quickly again, remember, if you're going to buy a bicycle, don't buy it from Roger Charlie, because he swindled people, and he didn't want you to know what was going on in the primate centers. So somebody that tries to keep the university's animal research a secret and is dishonest, I'd say stay away from him if you're looking at buying a bicycle. And let me see. If you have an interest in being on the show, if you're an animal researcher, or you're married to an animal researcher, or you think you know something about it, and you think we're wrong in some way in the things that we say here about animals in society or animals in research at the university, consider coming on the show. We'd love to hear from you. And keep those calls and comments coming in. Remember, if you want to contact us, it's allanimals.org. Just put in the subject line, animals have rights, and we'll read your comments and questions. So I think with that, we're going to move on to our Animals in the Law Today feature with attorney Leslie Hamilton. I'm sure she has some interesting news for us and information about the law and how it relates to animals. Leslie.
Thank you, Rick, and welcome back this evening to Animals and the Law Today. As I mentioned during our last broadcast, the Humane Society of the United States has filed a false claims action against the Hallmark Meat Company. The Hallmark Meat Company was found to have seriously abused the farm animals that it keeps at its slaughterhouse. Slaughterhouse is an interesting term. I don't know where that comes from. It certainly isn't a house. The Chino, California company has been charged with selling falsely has been sued by the Humane Society of the United States because it sells its meat through the school lunch program to the federal government. And when it sold that meat, it advertised the meat as being humanely slaughtered as required by the Federal Humane Slaughter Act, and in fact it was not. The film that was produced by the Humane Society of the United States showed the cows who were, quote, down cows, and that is cows that have broken limbs or are so very ill that they can't stand up, being dragged across their pens by men in forklift-type trucks. At any rate, the Humane Society of the United States, as I have indicated, has sued the company, and if the Humane Society is successful in their suit, they will be able to recover the full value of all of the meat that was sold under contract by Hallmark to the federal government for the school lunch programs. This law, as I indicated before, is 150 years old. It was originally promulgated in 1863 when war profiteers during the Civil War were selling to the federal government horses and mules who were ill or lame. And it allows essentially a private citizen to sue on behalf of the federal government for fraud against the government, essentially arming the citizenry in the battle against fraud. The law essentially then deputizes private citizens as assistant or as attorney generals, assistant attorney generals. And you ask, why would this relate to animals other than through something like a slaughterhouse? Well, I think it has been used, and it would be very efficiently used in a lawsuit brought by someone working for a researcher in a research institution, for example, like the one here in Madison. Much of the research using animals in research institutions at universities is funded by the federal government, by the National Institute of Health. And if you are working in such a lab or for some other reason have information that the statistics that are being reported to the government in the grant proposals is in fact not true, you could file a claim against the researcher and the institution on behalf of the federal government. The procedure for doing so is fairly straightforward. You put together a statement of all of the facts that you are aware of, and you file it with the federal district court, which is here in Madison, if you're suing, for example, the University of Wisconsin. You also serve a copy of your complaint on the U.S. attorney, who is also here in Madison. And for 60 days, the U.S. attorney then reviews the complaint, talks to you, perhaps interviews other people, and determines whether or not the U.S. government would like to intervene. If the U.S. government intervenes, then they will take over the prosecution. If they decline to intervene, then you essentially are responsible for bringing the case. If you have a case, if you have evidence of any kind of fraud, and you prevail, you are entitled to anywhere from 10 to 25% of the value of the grant being received by the researcher times 3. That's treble damages. So if you have a researcher, for example, who has received $5 million over the last 5 years to study whatever it might be, alcohol in rhesus macaques, for example, and the researcher is claiming that it is using X number of monkeys, and in fact is not using that number of monkeys, is using fewer monkeys, such that the statistical validity of that research is questionable. You may have a cause of action under the False Claims Act. $5 million grant from NIH times 3 is $15 million of fraudulently obtained money from the NIH. You would, as the complainant, as I indicated, be entitled to up to 25% of that amount. In addition, you would get your attorney's fees and your costs. Now, I'm not alleging that there's any fraud at all going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have no evidence that there is at this point. We are not in the labs. However, if you would like to do some good and maybe get rich in the process, the federal government has provided you with a clear opportunity to pursue such a claim. And that's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth today in animals and the law. Thank you. Back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Leslie. Maybe I'll get a job at the Primate Center and look for fraud. Maybe I'll get rich. Let's see. I just want to thank you again for the people that have taken the time to write in and contact us with comments and questions. I was actually talking in person with a viewer last week, and they asked me, once they saw last week's show, they said, okay, we understand that government lies, government keeps the bad things it does a secret. They understood the CIA hiding the tapes, the university destroying the tapes of the primate experimentation. They agreed that from all of what we were looking at with all of the SIV, the HIV studies, and it's been a complete failure, that probably the science is bogus, that there's just all sorts of things that are wrong with it. But they asked, but how is that really very much different than, say, a $1,000 toilet seat or a $500 hammer? I mean, really, is it what's so out of the ordinary about it? We know government isn't very honest, and we know that university is just part of government. So it's interesting. To me, the reason that all of this matters is that it comes down to basically the same question as to why we care about other people. What is it that we think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights basically says that every human in the world should have their basic rights protected. So that there's some commonality is the claim here. The implicit claim is that there's some commonality between us all that's of such high value that it supersedes the claims against you by government, by other people, that you have some sort of fundamental, inalienable rights. So what is about us that would make us think that all of us, no matter how different we are from each other, that we should all have those rights. And frankly, I think we do all have those rights. I think they're inherent. But what is it about us that we think gives us those rights? Well, is it something that arose only in humans? Or is it something that perhaps in an evolutionary sense predates us quite a bit? With humans, I guess one is certainly in the Western world that we can easily relate to is this idea of the golden rule, that however I want to be treated is the way I should treat you. And so it's interesting. There's a paper that was written some time ago. It was, the name of the paper is Altruistic Behavior in Rhesus Monkeys. It was written by Jules Massermaan, Stanley Wecklin, and William Terrace. And it was dated 1964, and it was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. At the time this was published, by the way, Jules Massermaan was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. Anyway, here's what they did. They built a box that had 2 compartments, and they had a monkey in each one of those compartments. They had taught the monkeys that if you pulled a couple chains in a certain order when lights inside the box flash in a certain way, that you'd receive a food pellet. And so the monkeys learned how to do this pretty quickly because, in fact, they're pretty smart. And so once the monkeys really knew how to do this, then all of a sudden, when they pulled the last chain and they were going to get the food pellet, the floor of the other side of the box where another monkey was in, that floor was electrified. And so the monkey that was on the other side received a painful electric shock. And so, first, why would they even do this? But nevertheless, what they discovered was that monkeys, when they realized that by pulling the last chain to get the food pellet, if it caused the monkey in the other compartment to receive an electric shock, they would just quit pulling the chain. They'd quit eating. In one case, one of the monkeys went without food for 12 days rather than shock the monkey on the other side of the cage. So they wanted to know, they asked questions like, well, let's look at these statistics here and say, are the monkeys that aren't pulling the chains, are they somehow the less dominant monkeys? But that wasn't the case. Or was it monkeys that knew each other? But that really didn't seem to be the case. The one thing that they saw that really seemed to predict whether or not a monkey would quit pulling the chain was whether or not they themselves had been on the receiving end of the experiment. If they'd been in the other box and been shocked, then when it was their turn to be in the side where they would pull the chain and get the food, they wouldn't shock another monkey. One of the monkeys went without food for 8 days, one of them for 12 days. Many of them just stopped pulling the chain for a while. So as I listen or read that story and think about it, it seems to me that the monkeys were basically following the golden rule. I'm certain that they weren't enunciating it like that. They weren't putting it into what we would call language. But certainly they were behaving as if they understood the golden rule. So then the question becomes, how like us do they have to be? How similar to us does another animal have to be before we're willing to say, well, all of the characteristics that I think matter, whether or not you can feel sad or lonely or happy or joyous, or you love your kids or don't like your neighbors, whatever it is that we think that makes everybody be allowed to, should be covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe it should be the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. Maybe all beings who are able to feel pain and pleasure, maybe they should all have some sort of fundamental basic rights. Seems to me that they should. And certainly as they become more and more like me or my neighbor or Leslie Hamilton or anybody that you know, if they become more like you, at what point do we say, at what point does it become wrong? At what point should we make it criminal? Just real quickly, let me point out something. This is the things that I'm telling you really aren't, they're really becoming more and more mainstream. in 2008, National Geographic put out an issue, and on the cover is a picture of this. I don't hope you can see this. It's a picture of a dog, and her name is Betsy, in fact. But the title of the article is "Inside Animal Minds," and it starts out with a subtitle of "Animals are smarter than you think," and it turns out to be true. Throughout the article, what we find is very good, detailed sort of. Well, here's one. This is Ozzy has a rich mental life, says Rob Shoemaker in his study subject and friend of 25 years. Orangutans are on a equal cognitive footing with African apes, or even surpass them on some tasks. Not only does Ozzy communicate his thoughts with abstract keyboard symbols, he also demonstrates a theory of mind, understanding another individual's perspective, and makes logical, thoughtful choices that show a mental flexibility some chimpanzees lack. In the wild, orangutans keep innovative cultural traditions. And so they go on. They're talking about orangutans, elephants, of course, even fish. Parrots, African gray parrots, as you might know, Irene Pepperberg's parrot Alex. Sheep recognize faces. They remember people's faces from years before. They like to see happy faces more than they do sad faces. This is a little blurb on Betsy, who is on the cover, the border collie. How much thought goes on behind those eyes? A lot in this case. 6-year-old Betsy can put names to objects faster than a great ape, and her vocabulary is at 340 words and counting. Her smarts showed up early. At 10 weeks, she would sit on command and was soon picking up on names of items and rushing to retrieve them. Ball, rope, paper, box, keys, and dozens more. She now knows at least 15 people by name. And in scientific tests, she's proved skill at linking photographs with the objects they represent. Now, these are the people that, of course, care about animals and believe that, in fact, animals, because of their studies, that they do have very complex minds. Here at the Primate Center, though, it's sort of interesting. Here's what Ned Kalin says. Ned Kalin is one of these people that studies fear in monkeys. He burns out the emotion centers of their brains and then frightens them in different ways and then kills them and cuts up their brains and he works with Richard Davidson. Here's what Ned Kalin says. Animals do a lot of things instinctively, but people, and probably monkeys, have the ability to think 20 steps into the future. In the end, I'm going to feel great because I worked hard to get there, or I'm going to get a lot of credit for this. It's the prefrontal cortex that brings these emotions into play and guides us in our behavior. Here's another good one here. I like this one. Here's Jane Goodall. She had been here in 1993 and she was talking about the Primate Center. She says, the point is, do rhesus monkeys have emotions? Do they have feelings? Do they have pain? Do they have sophisticated social structures? All the answers are yes. It's Jane Goodall. Maybe she's been on the cover of National Geographic more than any other person. Here's what Victor Reinhardt I've mentioned him before on the show. He was a veterinarian that the Primate Center ran off because of his concern for the monkeys. One of the Primate Center directors, Goy, in fact, said that he was a world-renowned expert on primate well-being. When the next director came in, they got rid of him. Anyway, Victor Reinhardt says, is it really so far-fetched to compare this situation with that of human prisoners kept in concentration camps? Here's some researchers writing. They say they're writing about their work on abstract conceptualization in baboons. Abstract conceptualization. To be sure, the stakes are high. What is at issue is no arcane point, but the very distinction between the minds of human beings and non-human animals. This is another researcher was in 2002 Scientific American. This is another person who experiments on monkeys. It's not usually possible to study the activity of individual neurons in awake humans, so we perform our experiments with alert monkeys that have been trained to report what they are perceiving by pressing levers or by looking in a particular direction. Monkeys' brains are organized like those of humans, and they respond to stimuli much as humans do. Consequently, we think that the animals are conscious in somewhat the same way as humans are. So how like this do they have to be? Before, if you said, well, they're conscious the same way humans are, they would say, oh, that's some wild anthropomorphism, that really animals aren't like humans. But in fact, all of the research seems to say that they are. So that's why this matters. This matters in the same way that it did when Germans had Jews and gypsies and Poles and homosexuals in laboratories and were experimenting on them. Because we can stop and imagine what it was they might be going through. And it's not far-fetched, of course, for me to believe that I might know what a Pole or a gypsy or a Jew might be experiencing at the hands of a German vivisector. Likewise, because monkeys have minds so much like ours, and dogs do, and even rats and mice, all these animals are sentient like we are. And so whatever it is, when we learn about these experiments, if we can put ourselves in their place and try to imagine what it is that they might be experiencing, we're not so far off. We're pretty close, I think. A couple years ago, I was at a chimpanzee sanctuary, and I got to know a number of chimpanzees. I also got to know a monkey. I've actually had a lot of animal friends. I've known lots of horses. I've known lots of goats. I had a pig friend. I've known a gerbil pretty closely. I've known, of course, lots of dogs and cats. Oh, the dog I have right now, Mickey, he's a rescue. He's a schnoodle, part poodle, part schnauzer. He doesn't know he's either one, of course. But he loves the ball. He's a ball boy. And he brings me the ball all the time when we're in the house. And so I throw it down the hall, and he gets all excited. He runs and gets it for me. And he seems to smile quite a bit when I throw the ball for him. But sometimes he doesn't want me to get the ball from him, and he takes me outside. Now, he leads me to the door and runs out, drops the ball and runs out in the yard so I can throw the ball out back. And it doesn't take a genius or a psychologist to recognize that he has intent. He's brought me the ball after I played with it for a while, and he leads me outside and gets me to throw the ball in the backyard. And that's pretty darn smart, and I think he deserves rights. And remember, the dogs and the cats and the monkeys are a lot like you. The chickens and the cows and the geese, they're a lot like me. See you next week. Rick Bogle.